So the concept of the ancient regime that refers essentially to the ancient regime, the old order, the estate system. It is very feudal. It's very medieval. And the point we're trying to make here is by the time we're at the eve of the revolution, these rigid differences aren't there anymore. In feudalism, the nobles were the rich and everybody else was poor, but proto-capitalism turning into capitalism has created such a fluid, growing, wealthy, educated class that those ridges are becoming blurred. The Roman nobility have already done it, and the bourgeoisie are even doing it more. So it makes sense that we understand why the bourgeoisie are going to want participation. They're more educated than most people are in the nobility. They're inspired by the Enlightenment and concepts of their rights. They believe they should be able to participate in government, especially in the fact that the government is supported by much of the money they're making. They want to say. And the government never actually offers them the same kind of deal that they offer the second nobility, like Louis XIV and tax exemptions, and never extended them because the government needs them. As we saw Louis XIV, he was accumulating huge debt because of these tax breaks in his wars. And so he needed to continue taxing the bourgeoisie. So it's inevitable that a crisis is eventually going to happen. And the poor are always on the edge of starvation, and to continue to tax them and tax them and tax them was setting up a situation where they were going to reach desperation. And history shows us that when the poor reach a point of desperation, that revolt oftentimes is inevitable. So this crisis of political legitimacy is rising after Louis XIV's death in 1715. Put the 5-year-old Louis XV on the throne. His regent, the Duke of Orleans, gave some rights back to the nobility and the parliaments. So Louis XV is going to inherit a throne in which the nobles feel slightly more empowered and at the same time are still holding on to their tax exemptions. So these parliaments were really more high courts. They're given the right to evaluate written royal decrees. So they're kind of like a court system in America or the Supreme Court. They were full of, by this point, robe nobles that were loyal to the king who had given them the nobility that was like a rubber stamp. So the key event that plays out is going to be financial crisis and financial crisis of the state as we lead up to the French Revolution. So McKay points out that to pay for the War of Austrian Succession, Louis XV levied a 5% tax on the income of everyone. That included the nobility. War had driven them so deep into debt that they needed extra tax income to pay off that debt or they're going to default on their loans. And so the Parliament of Paris protested and the monarchy conceded in this event. They said, you can't do that. You've given us tax exemption. You can't unilaterally put taxes on it. The key theme here is that it's not as if the nobles are completely against the idea of taxation. They're against the idea of taxation without getting political power. And that's what they protest. And so when the king steps down, he realizes that this is going to be an issue. But Louis XV is weak, and he's not that intelligent. And the king realizes that when he tries this again during the 7 Years' War, the parliaments again successfully protested against his right to levy taxes. So Louis XV gives us a great example that he's inherited a corrupt system. Louis XIV left garbage left over for everybody else. There was huge debt and no way to deal with it. We have this great debate in our society about debt, but at the end of the day, debt can't be paid down and paid down in a quick way without new forms of income. And that's true of the state. And Louis XV realized that he had growing debt from these wars. And on top of it, the functioning of the everyday government was leading to growing debt. They weren't even able to pay their everyday bills, and so he needed new sources of income to get his debt under control. But what these two instances, the Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, showed Louis that the only way nobles were willing to give up that money to help pay off the state would be as if he gave up his claim to absolutism, which Louis XV is unwilling to do. So this is the problem with the politics in France. Parliament of Paris asserted the king could not levy taxes without their consent. And this is similar to how the Parliament in England, a legislative body rather than judicial, justified its power. And that all goes all the way back to 1215 and the signing of the Magna Carta, the idea that the king couldn't levy extra taxes without consent of the nobility. Louis XV then tries to crush these parliaments. He appoints Rene Maupeou as chancellor, and he attempts to crush the parliaments. He broke them apart. He appointed royals into the courts. These are called the Maupeou parliaments. Basically, he appointed people that were complete royalists and were rubber stamps. And they reinstated small taxes. The reality is this was a huge mistake because smear campaigns were brought out against the king, against Maupeou, even against Madame de Pompadour, his mistress that we've studied in the form of the Enlightenment. And that little bit of taxes they were leveling was not even catching up anyway with their debt. So in the way, it was when Louis XV's reign is all about trying to avoid decentralization. If he wants the state to survive and pay off their debt, he's got to give up his power. He's unwilling to do this. And luckily for him, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, he dies before decentralization occurs. And that is going to be left to Louis XVI, who's going to desperately try to fix the situation in France. Louis XVI is only 20 years when he takes the throne. He famously said, instead of "I am the state," he says, "What I should like most is to be loved." He was interested in being the king that fixes France, and the people, everybody look at him too as a figure of as a father. He gets rid of Maupeou. He really generally, Louis XVI in some ways is a tragic character, if you can say that about an absolute monarch, and that he really did want to try to fix the issues of the state. And he realized that there was no way around it. At the end of the day, the only way that they were going to deal with their debt crisis was to tax the upper estates. It was the only way. They needed that access to money. And France could pay off its debt. The money was there. It was about getting access to it. How are you an absolute monarch and take that money? In France, that was the deal. For the nobles to give up their political power and to demilitarize and to recognize the king as the final authority of the land, there was a cost, and that cost was tax breaks. And the only way they're going to pay up is in exchange for political control. So you got nobles asking for more political control if they're going to give up taxes, and you got the bourgeoisie sitting in the third estate arguing through Enlightenment thought that they should have a say in some kind of legislative body. Most of the bourgeois liberals were supporters of constitutional monarchy, and they wanted a parliament and some kind of separation of powers and checks and balances, i.e. in the form of Montesquieu or what Great Britain had. And they're saying they want political participation. Louis XVI is trying to hold on to Bourbon absolutism. And in the end, it's really going to be inevitable that he cannot. The major crisis that occurs is two financial hits to the state. One is a financial hit to the people through an agricultural crisis. The other is the final nail in the coffin of the French finances of the state. The French decided that they were going to support the American Revolution to weaken the British. And in doing so, in their support of the American Revolution, they acquired a lot of debt accumulated onto the Austrian succession and 7 Years' Wars, and that is going to create a crisis for the French society. They were facing bankruptcy. Sorry. We can look at, if you think back to French support of the French Revolution, the famous figures like the Marquis de Lafayette, who provided military support and training to America's troops. In 1778, a formal alliance was made between the French and American ambassador Benjamin Franklin. In 1779, the Spanish and Dutch declared war against the British. And so a lot of this is to weaken the British. The American Constitution served as a social contract for republicanism. And this is the great irony in this, is that you have an absolute state supporting a revolution that's centered around Enlightenment thought, and not just constitutional monarchy, but the more radical form of republicanism, getting rid of a monarch altogether. This is Washington and Lafayette of Valley Forge to get that emphasis. And if you want a real view of this, you think of like the Statue of Liberty, the connection between the Americas and France. So we'll pick up on this next tomorrow.